The next part of living with an eternal perspective is that we need to look at Jesus expectantly. We need to really realize who God is and who Jesus is when he says he's coming back. I think that one of the biggest mistakes that we make as Christians is we don't have a correct perspective of who Jesus Christ is. I'm standing at on some land that my grandfather owned, and when I was growing up, my grandfather would take me and my brother here, and we would really spend a lot of time here learning some life lessons. I learned to drive here, I learned to fish, I learned to shoot guns. I learned so much here, but one of the greatest life lessons I ever had was when I realized my grandfather was not the man I thought he was. I grew up knowing my grandfather as a man who would sit on in his chair in front of the TV. He would watch Archie Bunker, he would watch Hee Haw, and then sometimes we would spend the night with him, and that's pretty much the image of my grandfather that I had until one day we were driving up on this very road, and when we got here, instead of horses, there was an entire herd of cattle that was not his, and all of these cattle were on his land, and they belonged somewhere else. And I just remember thinking, what are we going to do? You know, my grandfather, I thought he was so old at the time, and I will never forget when he got out of the car, he got onto one of his horses, and he took a BB gun, which was the only thing he had. And I will never forget as he began to circle those cattle, and he began to draw them in together, and there was a big old bull, and I remember as he went right after that bull on a horse, and he began to drive all of the cattle out of this gate and into this road, and he took them all the way down to someone else's land that they got out of, and he put them back. And I remember thinking to myself, in that moment I realized that my grandfather was not the man I thought he was. He was someone who had fought in wars. He was someone who grew up on horses and on farms, and he knew so much more than I thought he knew. I think it's the same way for us when we think about Jesus. So many of us just think of Jesus as a man here on earth that came and he taught us some great lessons, but we forget that Jesus was also God, and that there's an eternal perspective we need to have when we think about Jesus. When we come and worship, we're not worshiping a man that came and died. We are worshiping God in heaven. And Revelation 1, verse 1 tells us exactly what the book is about. It is the revelation of Jesus Christ. And I think that the most important thing we need to realize about this book is that Revelation is not about us getting barcodes on our forehead and in the end times. Revelation is revealing who Jesus Christ really is, and that is the Almighty God in heaven. And so it's funny as you read the book and you realize that as John's having this vision, he'll come across maybe an angel, and several times there are awkward moments where John will actually bow down to the angel, and the angel will immediately get on him and say, "What are you doing? You can't worship me. I'm just a created being like you. We've got to worship God in heaven, Jesus Christ, who's sitting on a throne." And so when we worship, remember that although we are so thankful that God loved us enough that he would humble himself and come to earth as a man, that is not the God that we are worshiping. We are worshiping this God who is now in heaven sitting on a throne, and that angels are bowing down to him. And all the people, whenever they see him, they're so awestruck by Jesus that they lay down their crowns, they lay down whatever they have before them as if they're not worthy to even be in his presence. And that's what we need when we come to worship God. We need to remember the eternal presence. You may even have things in life that you don't know how you're going to overcome. And it helps to have an eternal perspective of who Jesus is. Jesus is a God that is coming back, and he's not coming back on a donkey. It says he's coming back on a stallion. He is coming back with authority. And so whatever obstacles we may have in life, we need to remember how big Jesus really is, how powerful God really is in our life. And the only way we can truly live life with an eternal perspective is to have an expectant belief that Jesus Christ, God of the universe, is coming back one day to receive us to him and to take us to heaven.